Right. Well, thanks very much indeed, and good afternoon. Much is being said about this era of accelerated and intensified globalization. But it's been quite a while since I last heard anybody say that it's a boring time in which to live. Because as I stand here, the world is changing around us. Only last week I discovered that the number of Polish immigrants in Norway has now officially reached 80,000, twice as many as the second largest group, the Swedes. This is new. There is newness in this. And there is a world, we live in a world which is full of paradoxes. And I'll just very briefly, before I leave the floor to the speakers, because we don't have a lot of time for this session, and we're going to run out of time, make a couple of very brief comments about some of the paradoxes of globalization. One of them is the paradox of identity, how cultural identity has suddenly become a scarce resource. How globalization in many ways makes us more similar across the world. And yet, the more similar we become, the more different we try to be, because cultural difference is becoming a scarce resource. However, the more different we try to be, the more similar we become, because identity politics is a way of making cultural differences comparable, by making them conform to a shared grammar. So this is one of the big paradoxes of globalization. Another one to do with migration is to do with what Grete Brockmann spoke of briefly already this afternoon, about the paradoxes of multiculturalism or diversity, because this word is so slippery, as she said. So when Nicolas Sarkozy or Angela Merkel or David Cameron, when they are talking in rather negative terms about multiculturalism, they probably don't mean the same thing. It could be about migration as such. We're against immigration. We don't like multiculturalism. It could be against diversity, which is a much broader term. Diversity is not necessarily the same as multiculturalism. Or it could merely be about the tendency to develop parallel societies with their own moralities and a general tendency of moral decentralization at the level of named groups based on origins, which is also often associated with multiculturalism. At least it's beyond doubt that multiculturalism has received a lot of bad press recently. In the gay and happy 1990s, books were published with titles such as The Multicultural Riddle. This is a fascinating puzzle, A rather popular book in sociology and anthropology. A decade or so later, books about multiculturalism typically have titles such as The Multiculturalism Backlash or The Crisis of Multiculturalism, just to mention two book titles from last year. So obviously there has been a shift. Now this afternoon's first session is not going to be about solving the multicultural riddle or dealing with or resolving, as it were, the multicultural backlash, but rather, I think, to offer some descriptions about what is actually going on in the world. We have three distinguished speakers, each of whom represents a particular field of expertise, quite different forms of expertise, and in the course of the discussion we're going to discover just how complementary they are. I suggest we do it like this. We could sit here, all of us, perched on the stage throughout the session. I think instead, because at least one of the speakers is going to use PowerPoint, that we stay put in the audience until the debate. Each of the speakers will get 15 minutes each. I'm going to sit here and keep time. And I'm going to be fairly strict because we want discussion and we're running a little bit late. So without any more ado, I'd like to give the floor to the first speaker, Professor Jørgen Carling, who's at Human Geography at PRIO, and who has worked extensively on migration, not least with respect to remittances, and with a particular, I think, affinity for Cape Verdeans and their migration patterns. So, Jørgen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this exciting gathering. As Thomas mentioned, I come from the Peace Research Institute Oslo, where we do research on the conditions for peaceful coexistence or peaceful relations between states, groups, and people. And it's striking how migration has become a much more central element or central aspect of dealing with that mission than it was, for instance, when the Institute was founded some 50 years ago. Part of my own background is in demography, and I've been challenged with trying to link what's evident from numbers with the topics of this conference. So that's what I'll try to do, and I've picked out 3 areas in which I think statistics can tell us something interesting about multiculturalism, migration, citizenship, and free speech. It's a fairly broad and ambitious scope for a conference, but this is sort of an attempt to set the stage from a demographic perspective. So I see three aspects of these topics that we might illustrate with migration statistics. The first one is the sheer magnitude of adaptation that's needed as a result of migration on the part of societies receiving immigrants and on the part of all the individuals who have to find their way into a new society. The second obvious element is about the composition of our societies, where at least countries such as Norway have a lot of numbers at hand to say something about that and how it's changing. The third element is a bit more challenging in terms of numbers, but all the more important. It's about how migration is forging new types of connections between our societies and societies in other parts of the world. This is a photo that was used to promote this conference. And I've never really delved into migration history, but it struck me looking at this photo how, to me, the most I should put it, the most striking element of it is this duality between the overwhelming nature of transatlantic migration for the individuals. I mean, just imagine how overwhelming it must have felt for every person on that ship. And then, sort of at the macro level, how overwhelming it was for America to receive boatload after boatload of immigrants, such as this one. So that extreme duality between the overwhelming experience for the individual and the overwhelming challenges it presented for society is worth relating to when we discuss migration. And in terms of the numbers, we have here figures from United States immigration history, and all of it is history, but the distant history 100 years ago, and the green line there over the past 40 years. So one curve is exactly 100 years before the other one. And if we disregard the specific peaks and troughs, the overall impression here is that immigration was much more significant 100 years ago. So if we picked 100 random Americans on the street 100 years ago, one of them would have been a person who arrived during the last year. If we do the same today, it's more like 1 in 300 has arrived during the last year. So there's a big difference. It's a big phenomenon today, but much less so than 100 years ago. Now what I'll do is to show a new version of the same graph with two European curves superimposed for Norway and the Netherlands over the past 40 years. I used Norway because we're in Norway. I used the Netherlands partly because I've done much of my own research in the Netherlands, but also because it's a country that represents Northwestern European experiences in a better way than Norway, I think. There are variations, but it adds to the picture. And also the Netherlands is even better than Norway at having good data and making it accessible to the public and to researchers. So this is what it shows. And the most striking thing here by far is the green curve for Norway, where we see that throughout the 1970s, 80s, 90s, the weight of immigration was comparable in Norway to the contemporary experience of the United States. But over the past decade, the Norwegian experience has jumped to resemble the historical experience of the United States. So today in Norway, if we go out on the street and pick 100 random people, one of them will have arrived during the past year. And that's historically very, very high. Now turning to the composition of population, because as people arrive, we know that the body of population, the people who live here, will change in terms of how many of them were actually born elsewhere. And historically, it's striking how throughout the great transatlantic migration, that proportion remained relatively constant in the United States at around 14% of the population at any one time being foreign-born. Then it dropped after the Second World War because of lower immigration to an all-time low around 1970. And then it's been rising again and reapproaching historical levels. So now I'll do the same with the two European countries. And we see that Norway and the Netherlands as well are now reapproaching the historical experience of the United States in terms of the proportion of people in our societies who were born abroad. These are relatively crude measures of this composition element, just counting how many people were born abroad versus how many people were born here. Part of the beauty of demography is being able to look more in detail at the tendencies or processes that might be so apparent, but are there when you start looking at specific instances or specific subgroups. And what I'm interested in particular is the generational aspect and how migration is, or the experiences of migration for a society is not just about where people were born, but about their place in a migration history or a family history of migration. So looking again at our 3 countries, this shows not just how many people were born abroad, but how many people were born in each country of immigrant parents. And if we add together the immigrants and the children of immigrants, we see almost a quarter of the population in the US and around 13% of the population in Norway. What's striking in this figure, however, is the middle segment. I guess the colors are a bit similar here, but the what's light green and not as sort of yellowish as the top segment, we see it extremely different between the 3 countries. Children or people who are born in Norway with 2 immigrant parents still make up a very small proportion of Norwegian society, but they constitute a sizable proportion of American society. The Netherlands is somewhere in between, partly because the Netherlands is slightly ahead of Norway in a development that all of Europe is experiencing, or all of Northwestern Europe. So to illustrate how this is not just about differences between countries, but really about a transformation going on right now, I'll look specifically at the Netherlands and at young adults. Who are the young adults in the Netherlands? People in their late 20s. I've split the people with some kind of immigrant background into 4 groups. Immigrants themselves are the solid lines, and the dashed lines represent children of immigrants. And we see, yes, immigrants from non-Western countries constitute a greater proportion of this age group today than they did 15 years ago. It's risen from 11 to 16%. It's a rise, but nothing really phenomenal. And the same with Western immigrants. There are more of them than there were, mostly because of increased intra-European migration. But the really big change here, the transformation, is about the children of immigrants, and especially children of immigrants from non-Western countries. A completely marginal group in numerical terms 15 years ago, now constituting more than 10% of young adults in the Netherlands. This, I argue, is in a way the most exciting part of demographic change as a result of migration. We've always had immigrants, or we've had immigrants for hundreds of years. The numbers differ, the origins differ. What's qualitatively new today is the presence of large numbers of children of immigrants who are old enough to be visible in society. That's not something Norway has experienced for a long time, and it goes for much of Europe as well. In Norway, we've had a handful of people who've been, in a way, front-runners in this development, people who are born and raised in Norway, children of Pakistani immigrants, who've made careers in politics or the media. And we know of them as individuals, and we think of them as talented individuals, which of course they are. But what's important here is that they are really the front runners of a development that is going to unfold in Norwegian society over the coming decade or 2, and which has the potential to change fundamentally, I think, the dichotomy between immigrants and host country population. Because we think of the host population and the immigrants as the dichotomy, and now we will have more and more people who are born and raised in Norway, old enough to be active members of society, and have 2 immigrant parents. So on the composition element, this is where I see things as changing in an exciting way in Europe, and again, bringing us closer to the historical experience of the United States. So finally, I turn to connection, because to me, partly because of my research interests, one of the most exciting elements of migration is not just what's happening to our societies internally, but how migration is creating new forms of connectedness between our societies and societies elsewhere. And historically, the country of origin has been often a kind of a mythical reference point for immigrants, such as in this cartoon, which reads, "The country that Grandpa came from was a stinking hellhole of unspeakable poverty, where everyone was always happy." And this ambivalence in relation to the country of origin still holds true. And it's a source of fascination for those of us who do research on migrant transnationalism. But a big change is that the country of origin isn't just this mythical reference point. It's part of an ongoing dynamic relationship in people's lives. So now going back to the specific experience of Norway, we now have sizable immigrant groups, 1,000 people or more, from 35 countries outside of Europe. So many more if we also considered Europeans now and just looking beyond Europe. 9 countries with more than 10,000 immigrants in Norway, another 26 with more than 1,000. And this is not just about where people came from and now they're in Norway. It's also about where their important family members, friends, business partners, political, religious reference points might be in their daily lives. So it's really about these lines being stretched out across the globe from Norway as a result of migration. Exactly how these ties are maintained varies a lot from one group to the next. So for instance, if we consider Pakistanis in Norway, almost 90% of Pakistanis in Norway, including children of Pakistanis who are born and raised in Norway, have visited Pakistan at least once over the past 5 years. About a third of Pakistanis send money to relatives in Pakistan on a regular basis, at least once a year. If we take a very different immigrant group, Somalis, we see different forms of ties. For obvious reasons, fewer Somalis have visited Somalia over the past 5 years, but still close to a quarter. And about 2/3 send money on a regular basis, many of them also struggling to make ends meet in Norway. So to me, looking at this picture of connectedness makes me feel that multiculturalism is a bit of a navel-gazing concept. We focus on what's happening in our society because of these people who've come from elsewhere. But it's not obvious that that's the relevant reference point for understanding what's going on. It is also very much about these connections between what the institutions and so on that we as sort of majority Norwegians consider important, or Europeans or Americans for that matter, and institutions, individuals, points of reference elsewhere in the world. So summing it up, about adaptation, it's remarkable how some European countries, including Norway, are now experiencing migration at the level of the historical experience of the United States, if we think in terms of the inflow of migrants compared to the size of the resident population. And then on composition, I think the really exciting thing, the big change, is the growth of the second generation, the children of immigrants, who are now old enough to make a difference in society, to be seen and be heard, and many enough to be more than isolated individuals, and who have the capacity to break apart this dichotomy of hosts and immigrants. And then finally, about the connectedness, that in our discussions of multiculturalism, we must not forget that the reference points that are important and relevant also lie beyond the societies we focus our discussions on. Thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah, wonderful, Jørgen. Thanks so much. Great stuff and lots of numbers. So the next conference will be on transnational communities then, next year. Anyway, the next speaker represents, a different kind of intellectual, I suppose. That's one of the wonderful things about conferences on diversity, that you can also have diverse speakers. I suspect that we will have fewer numbers and more stories, but I don't know, because I haven't heard him yet. But Christopher de Bellaigue is a writer and journalist who has written a number of books. His most recent one is from Iran and is called Patriot of Persia, Muhammad Mossadegh and a Very British Coup. So please, floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for that mercifully brief introduction. There we are. Small Englishman. I believe I am the only Englishman to have applied for Iranian citizenship since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Living as a foreigner in Iran was proving to be a bureaucratic headache involving incessant visa renewals. I was married to an Iranian, and we had children. In most other countries, that would qualify me for citizenship. Why not Iran? So in 2004, I filled out some forms, submitted my documents, and awaited the official response. I'm still waiting. Theoretically, it is possible for a foreign man to become Iranian. In practice, it is very nearly impossible. Millions of Afghan men have lived in Iran for varying periods of time since the Soviet invasion of their country, and I have yet to hear of a single instance where one has been offered citizenship. The case of women is different. As a woman, the act of marriage signifies that you are being passed from your father to your husband. The husband's identity, his country, they become yours, or rather, you become theirs. Foreign women who marry Iranian men immediately qualify for citizenship. In Europe, we continue to use terms such as the West and the Islamic world, but we are, or we should be, less and less convinced by them. With the commingling of cultures and people, such words are losing their meaning. But they survive in Iran. A binary, almost Manichaean view of culture and identity prevails. The Islamic Republic worries about cultural imperialism. The ills of family breakup and premarital sex are blamed on the West and its arsenal of movies, lewd fashions, and liberal democracy. Although the country has large minorities, Iran aims to be monocultural, Shia, Persian-speaking, patriotic. This vision of the country has been refined as a result of 1979, but it predates the revolution, and it will last for the foreseeable future. I have yet to hear it said in Iran that the Afghan community there has in any way enriched Iranian society. Indeed, I suspect that few Iranians consider that the Afghans constitute anything like a community. There is a widespread animus against Arabs. No separatist movement of any kind has been strong enough to blunt this impulse towards centralization. On the contrary, authenticity is the watchword, and the idea that Iran is part of a moving matrix of identities barely exists. No one has heard of fusion cuisine in Teheran. Iranians call abroad Kharij. Kharij means outside, without. In fact, it means the West. Afghanistan, Iraq, they are not Kharij. There are three categories of consumer goods in Iran. Something is either Iranian, Chinese, or Khariji. Khariji is best. I, as a Westerner, am also Khariji, but here a different moral judgment applies. Khariji means rich, white, and educated. It can also mean politically manipulative and of dubious personal morals. It is impossible to be a Khariji and to have Iran's best interests at heart. Some of you may have seen the celebrated Iranian film, A Separation. It opens with a troubled couple divided over whether to move to Kharij or to divorce. Nader and Simin are arguing in front of a judge. Simin says she wants to go abroad because she doesn't want to bring up her daughter in what she calls these conditions. Here, in 2 words, are expressed the frustrations felt by many middle-class Iranian women. To be educated, but infantilized by the law and society. To be aware without being emancipated. For Simin, Kharij means an alternative for herself and her daughter. Now consider Nader. He does not want to go. And this is because he must care for his father, who has Alzheimer's. Later on, we learn that Nader is patriotic. His attachment to his homeland is deep and emotional. It extends to encouraging his daughter to use Persian words as opposed to Arabic loanwords. And yet, the Iranian viewer is able to see through Nader. He is a man in a man's world. He may not enjoy living under the Islamic Republic, but he has a good status in Iran. Nader has a white-collar job, and until now, mastery of his own house. Would that hold true in meritocratic, women-friendly Kharij, where he would have to start at the very bottom, and where Simin, who is a linguist, might have a head start over him? Very likely not. So Nader's patriotism, his attachment to his father, these start to seem self-serving as well as altruistic. In 2007, I moved with my family from Iran to England. My wife was moving to a country she did not know, I to a country I thought I knew, but which I found to be much changed. Our children, well, they would make of things what they would. One evening this May, I went with my wife to Wandsworth Town Hall in South London. The town hall was built in the 1930s. It is big and banded with symbolic bas-reliefs of a man driving piles into the banks of a local river, of a mock mayor at a medieval fair, of Dr. Johnson taking tea up the road. Inside the marbled vestibule, we admired a long carved table surmounted by a Viking ship, symbol of the borough. Others were milling around, Pakistanis, Somalis, Southeast Asians, a few Australians and South Africans. Presently, we were summoned into a panelled debating chamber with a huge stained glass skylight and invited to sit at the desks there. The man next to me said he had come to watch his wife become a citizen. Same here, I said. He had been in Britain since 1972. What about you, he asked. I was born here, I said. The deputy mayor's speech was quite good. He said that this moment represented for many people the achievement of a long-cherished goal, of becoming British. He reminded us that Wandsworth had been multicultural for some time. The Vikings had got as far as Putney. The Huguenots had come after the Edict of Nantes had been revoked. They remembered in many local street names. There have since been Black and South Asian members of Parliament and councillors. Here was a sanitised version. The deputy mayor's words did not record the anguish that attended these and other arrivals, the sense on the part of those already there of being supplanted, and on the part of those arriving of not being welcome. The ceremony with its oath and canned Elgar and photograph with the deputy mayor and a portrait of the Queen was perfectly phony. But it served a useful purpose, as such ceremonies do. It was an event to remember, and when the following month the Queen chugged down river as part of her Golden Jubilee celebrations, it is a fair guess that those few dozen new citizens remembered their oath of loyalty and felt a heightened sense of attachment. She would never admit it, but I believe my wife did. Now, in the time that remains, I would like to take you on a second, rather different journey into Europe. The starting point is not Iran, but Turkey. And here too there has been much resistance to multiculturalism. The decline of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the Turkish Republic had meant the end of that old luxury, pluralism. A restrictive culture seemed necessary to keep Anatolia intact, Turkish, Sunni, secular. The pains and conflicts conflicts that accompanied the transition sent subjects of the Ottoman Empire and citizens of the Turkish Republic spinning around the world. I spent the years 2004 to 2006 researching a small part of Turkey. The district I concentrated on was Varto in the province of Muş in the little visited eastern part of Anatolia. Varto is a small and isolated place, inhabited by just 41,000 people, but it is part of an international network, cultural, sentimental, economic. In order to understand Varto, it proved necessary not only to visit many other places inside Turkey, but also Armenia, Iraq, and several European countries. I could have added the United States, Lebanon, and Syria to this list. In the summers, when migrants and their children visit Varto, and the German language may be heard in the bazaars, a small part of the diaspora returns. Most of the time, however, Varto's cosmopolitanism is expressed in an absence, whole generations gone away. This pattern, or something like it, holds true for countless places in eastern Turkey. At the beginning of the 19th century, Varto was inhabited by Sunni Kurds, Armenians, and some Muslim Circassians that the Ottomans had brought in from the Caucasus. In 1915, the Ottoman authorities and the Kurds launched their infamous assault on the Armenians, who, it was feared, intended to make common cause with the advancing Russians. The Armenians of Varto were mostly wiped out by Kurdish tribesmen who took possession of their lands and wealth. A smaller number got away to Syria or Istanbul. Even fewer converted to Islam and stayed. That left the Kurds, whom Ataturk later tried to Turkify and secularize. The result was a series of rebellions culminating in today's uprising by the PKK. People from Varto, or Vartolus, have been closely involved in many conflicts, while Varto has also been the scene of an anguished process of self-discovery by another group. This group is the Alevis, who practice a kind of folk Shiism and were reviled by the Ottomans and the Sunni Kurds. For them, Ataturk's secular revolution was an opportunity. They became secularists. Having never really examined their ethnic identity, many of them decided that they were Turks. But this approach did not lead to their full integration. The Alevis of Varto were no longer liable to be killed, but they remained second-class citizens. In the 1960s and 70s, many came under the sway of revolutionary movements, and some were attracted by Kurdish nationalism. This led to another change of identity. Many Alevis decided that they were in fact not Turks, but Kurds. War, discrimination, and poverty have led thousands of Vartolus to leave Turkey. Many cannot return because of their affiliations to illegal groups. Some have married other Vartolus. The diaspora is vast when compared to the home community. While I was visiting Germany, I met Varto Armenians who had been Kurdified, others who had been Turkified, and yet others who, having first been Kurdified or Turkified, were now trying to rediscover their lost Armenian identity. I met Alevis who considered themselves to be Kurds and others who regarded themselves as Turks. I was befriended by a man, an Alevi, who was part of a collaborative effort to expand and standardize the Zaza language, which is spoken by many Alevis but lacks modern vocabulary and idioms. By day, this man was a German primary school teacher. By night, he struggled to save a dying language. His children inhabited several milieus at once. I'm not sure whether what I have described represents the expansion of Varto so that it becomes something bigger than its origins, or its dilution to the point where it means nothing at all. What is certain is that multiculturalism is not something that simply affects societies. It is a process going on inside individuals too. How much longer do I have?
30 seconds?
No. I tried to capture the cultural snarl-ups in my book on Varto, Rebel Land. from which I propose to read a few paragraphs. In Berlin, I was befriended by a Sunni Kurd whose grandfather had been who had been involved in a famous Kurdish revolt in 1925, and whose perspective I adopt in the following passage. This man took me out one evening to a Kurdish nightclub, but there was something confusing about the experience. The young people around us, second-generation immigrants, spoke Turkish to one another, not Kurdish or Zaza. The food we ate was classic Eastern Mediterranean fare, nothing Kurdish about it at all. The young people at the tables around you are chatting in Turkish. The parents of these kids, people your age, were Kurds when they left Anatolia 2 or 3 decades ago. How is it that their children, despite spending all their lives in Berlin, seem to have become Turks? Your own son, for instance, he speaks Turkish better than you, and Kurdish with curmudgeonly forbearance. You told yourself you'd go back, the classic immigrant self-deception. You own an internet cafe and a travel agency, running tours to Cappadocia. Such is the depth and breadth of this community. Such is the ability of its members to duplicate the services provided by the host nation. It's possible to spend the day in productive and profitable activity and not be required to utter a word of German. Even now, 30 years after you got here, you're uncomfortable speaking the language of your hosts. The following evening in the train, riding a packed car through the suburbs, you are accosted by 2 loud drunks. They are shouting into bottles of beer. They fling out some horrid song, then they lose the thread and see you, short, diffident, and foreign. They address you. They would like to know, nothing personal, no harm meant, if you are by any chance from Israel. That's right, sir, Israel. You reply quietly, evenly as the conditions require. You have been here before. I am a Kurd. Not even a Turk? No, a Kurd. They are fiery-faced from mirth now, gasping, burping. One of them composes a few words. He'd like you to remind him of the name of that Kurd, you know, the one with the moustache. Abdullah Öcalan. What? More howls. Abdullah Öcalan. Is he your president? We don't have a president. At the next station, the scum dismount. The car is relieved by their departure. The atmosphere brightens. But still no one looks at you. A few minutes later, the train stops again, and everyone is invited to dismount and wait on the platform for the next train. It's an unscheduled stop. You decide to check that this is indeed the right platform for the airport, which is where your companion, the English writer, is going. Walking up the platform, you see a likely candidate, a swarthy, dark-haired fellow. You ask, "Bu trenin Sondura havalimanı mı?" The man stares blankly. "Must be an Arab," you mutter. "Where's a Turk when you need one?"
Yes, wonderful. Thanks so much. I mean, next time perhaps we can have another chapter. I mean, I wouldn't mind that, but I mean, alas, we have to move on with the program. So now we've had the North Atlantic part of the world. We've had the Turkey-Iran axis, and I think we're moving even slightly further east with the next speaker. I mean, PANKAJ MISHRA, who's known for his books and writings about, if I may be so bold as to try to summarize some of the topics of his work in 2 or 3 words: subcontinental modernity and the fraught relationship to the West, with a post-colonial slant. I hope that's not misrepresenting your work too much. So without any more ado, the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you, Thomas. Short Indian. I was actually originally going to speak about the multi-layered identities of people in the subcontinent, and how when they travel to a place like UK, and I must add that the UK and India and Pakistan are my primary reference points here. When they travel to these places, the expectations there of liberal democracies somehow disregard those those layered identities these immigrants have. But I changed my mind actually after a recent visit to Pakistan, traveling around Pakistan for a few weeks, where I met a lot of people who either had relatives in the UK or had themselves spent quite a bit of time there, sometimes as much as 30, 40 years before retiring, going back to Pakistan. And talking to them, it occurred to me that there's an undercovered aspect of this whole debate about citizenship, multiculturalism, immigration in Europe, which is that we don't think of the immigrants, what kind of perception of the West, or more specifically Europe, particularly Europe, parts of Europe which were historically dominant in parts of Asia, India and Pakistan, both colonized for a very long time by the British. And it seemed to me that to go back to what the first speaker said, connectedness, that the fact that these people have many more reference points, and not just reference points in the contemporary world, but historically, that we haven't perhaps given it as much thought, because their perceptions of Europe, both historically and, of course, shaped by recent events, particularly the events post 9/11 world, are somewhat disconcerting, but nevertheless important to consider when we talk about these people integrating into European societies. Because I think for a long time we've kind of worked with the assumptions of modernization theory, which some of you will remember, that people embrace modern liberal institutions and start to secularize accordingly. And people aspiring for economic, political freedoms, their cultural, religious attachments weaken progressively as their attachment to secular, modern, liberal societies grow. But I think it's a somewhat questionable assumption, and it's certainly proven to be the case that religion, the appeal of religion, particularly among Muslim communities, has not diminished. But I think the other assumption that Europe manifests in this particular paradigm, the ideals of liberalism perfectly, is also a questionable one, certainly in the eyes of these immigrants. The achievements of liberalism in Europe are undeniable. The extension of rights, particularly to sexual minorities, I think in the last 20, 30 years, has been a great achievement. But I think it all looks very differently when you look at it from the perspective of these immigrants, people who have, in many cases, a historical memory of liberalism, European-style liberalism, which is not about individual rights, which is complicit in many ways with imperialist structures. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think also the experience that a lot of these immigrants have, and talking to people in Pakistan, made me realize to the extent to which they were concerned, even though they were now very far away from the United Kingdom and from their relatives, but the extent to which they were concerned about the safety of their relatives, how the presence, how the rising Islamophobia, and particularly very individual instances of racism that almost all of them had suffered, how all of that had bred in them this kind of paranoia that their relatives were in some sense physically endangered back home. And also, I think the fact that wherever you looked, whether it's the tabloids or even the broadsheets, there was a kind of subtle Islamophobic message being passed around, being conveyed. In fact, it's very difficult to keep up with everything that's going on, even if you read the British press very rigorously. But in the last, I think, 5-6 years, particularly after the July, the bombings there in 2005, it's been very, very dispiriting to see the changed tone in many of the British papers. And that has a huge impact on how these immigrants see the project of integration into Europe, into a society like Britain's. Also, of course, the whole rhetoric, which one of the speakers mentioned, of majoritarian nationalism, the talk about multiculturalism being dead or being ineffective or being, in many cases, immoral. I think that also makes them feel extremely isolated, extremely alienated from the mainstream. So this kind of talk has been extremely counterproductive. But I think historically, going back to that seemed to me really important to consider, especially when you look at the geography of many of these small towns and cities in Pakistan and India that these immigrants come from. These geographies are still marked by colonialism. There was a very simple, extremely brutal division of these places into the white town and into the black town. The European presence there, the Europeans obviously were not seeking to integrate at all when they were there. In many ways, you could call that was a kind of negative multiculturalism, complete segregation in those places. And I think for a lot of people who have grown up in these cities and towns, they bring to Europe a certain idea that they will not be accepted into European society. And I think it's not just people from lower middle class or lower class backgrounds who feel that. It's also the experience of a lot of educated people. And again, yet again, historically, when you look at a place like India, even some of you may be familiar with the writer Neeraj Chaudhary, one of the greatest Anglophiles ever in India, who wrote extremely bitterly about how the racism of the British in India, no matter how much effort you put into acquiring British manners or British clothing, but there was no way to enter this colonial society, the society the British created for themselves within India, and how people like him, particularly educated people like him, were excluded, were mocked, and actually the British preferred the people who were not educated in the British way. They preferred the so-called martial races. They preferred the Sikhs and the Pathans to the educated people. And that particular experience, which obviously nationalist histories, nationalist textbooks, history textbooks in these places, they've always played up. That's part of their national myths of achieving independence, achieving freedom from what was essentially a racist regime. And I think then when they come to Europe, that's a historical part. Especially in the last 20, 30 years in the United Kingdom, we've had witnessed, this is now a sociological cliche, a degree of social breakdown, which a lot of Muslim immigrants in particular recoil from. This is the aftermath of the Thatcher Revolution, where a series of economic policies stressing individualism, the kind of built-in contempt for the family, and we see the results now in the sort of social indicators in terms of collapsing families, teenage pregnancy. And for a lot of people from fairly conservative backgrounds, this is a society that they want to stay away from. This is not a society they want to integrate into. So that perception, combined with the historical perception, and in the last 10 years, combined with the perception that Europe, or certainly large parts of the West, is at war with the Muslim world, and has killed hundreds of thousands of Muslims in parts of Asia, particularly in the neighborhood of a place like Pakistan, and increasingly now in Pakistan itself. That, again, I think creates a really serious gap of perception between how Europe sees itself, has seen itself as a center of liberalism, as a place ready to accommodate outsiders, and the perceptions of many of these immigrants who feel both historically marginalized and certainly not at all attracted by the sort of social liberalisms that are on offer in contemporary European society. And I think this is a problem we'll have to take on board. I mean, however shallow or simplistic the ideas that these immigrants have might be, the fact that they exist and they very much shape their perception of their life here and how they see themselves in the future. And I think I'm going to stop here, and maybe there'll be questions. But I just wanted to complicate this notion of integration.
Yes, wonderful. I'm sure you did.